Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Emily of Chipped and Polished, and today I want to share with you the transformation of this lane cedar chest. This was a custom project and had been passed down to the owner by her mother. Many years ago it had been painted red, but that wasn't quite what my client wanted. She wants this to be the coffee table in her living room, so the plan was to paint it to match her current furniture and bring it into the 21st century. First thing I did was start cleaning it with a mixture of 50-50 water and vinegar and a little bit of Dawn. And yes, the bottom had a few surprises for me. Luckily, none of those egg sacs burst forth with 1,000 babies. After taking care of all of the grime that was on it, it was time to go ahead and rinse. You always want to make sure that you rinse off all of your cleaner's residue so that it doesn't get in the way of your new finish adhering. Since the plan was to stain the top of this cedar chest, I went ahead and used citrus strip to strip the paint off the top. Now I know what y'all are thinking. If you've heard, citrus strip is not the best stripper there is, but it's what I had on hand. And if you know how to use it, it can be a good stripper. I think the trick with citrus strip is to brush it on very liberally. That way it's harder for it to dry out. There's plenty of product that can work that magic there. Immediately after applying the citrus strip, I went ahead and covered it with plastic wrap, and I made sure that there were no air bubbles. That way it can't dry out. While that citrus strip was taking a few minutes to marinate, I went ahead and covered up the key and lock portions of the body of the chest. That way I wouldn't get any paint or primer on them or go over them with a sander. If you're enjoying this video so far, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up. I'd also like to invite you to go ahead and subscribe to see more furniture flipping content. Also comment below and let me know what you think of this makeover. And here I started scuff sanding with a 120 grit sandpaper. This smoothed out any of the texturedness from that previous coat of paint since it was a little bit textured, and it also gives my paint and primer something to grip onto. Once everything was scuff sanded, I went ahead and got a damp microfiber cloth and wiped all of the dust away. Any dust like this can keep your paint from adhering, but it can also cause swirl marks if you don't wipe it away in between grits of sandpaper. Next, it was time to go ahead and patch any miscellaneous holes or scratches with wood filler. I'm using plastic wood here. And while that wood filler was drying, it was time to go ahead and peel back this plastic and start stripping off the paint from the top. I started scraping with a carbide scraper just to make sure that I could get the majority of what was on there in one go. Once I had the majority of that scraped off, I went ahead and started rinsing it with water and scrubbing at it with steel wool. There were a couple of areas where it was a little tougher to get all of the paint off. For that, I used a stripping brush. I rinsed everything down one more time, wiped off the residue, and then let it dry for a bit. While the top was drying, I went ahead and grabbed that 120 grit sandpaper again to smooth down the wood filler, make sure everything was smooth there, filled in as much as possible before priming. After smoothing out all of those spots, I went ahead and covered the top with plastic and then sanded the edge of the painter's tape so it would give me a clean line. I also went ahead and detail sanded the edges of the top. Next, it was time for priming. This is the Zenisser 123 primer. You can also roll on this primer, but I find it so much easier to spray it. It goes so much quicker and it's so much easier and gives you better coverage. I forgot to apply the stripper to the bottom edge of the top, so I started removing the paint with a 60 grit sandpaper before moving on to the higher grits. Once my primer was dry, I sanded that down a little bit with a 120 grit just to make sure that it was smooth, and then started painting. And the color that my client chose was a creamy white color, had a little bit of a gray undertone to it. And if you're wondering, here I just sprayed the surface with a little bit of water first. This is going to help my paint stretch a little bit more and not go on quite as thick. And quick tip here, you can wrap your brush in plastic wrap or put it in a Ziploc baggie and then put it in the refrigerator in between uses and it won't dry out. I was about to start sanding the top down, but I felt like the edges of the veneer around the top were a little bit thin, so I put painter's tape around the edge just to protect it. When sanding this top down to prep for stain, I sanded first with a 120 grit, then moved on to a 150 grit, and then finally a 180 grit. After finishing with my sander, I sanded all of the edges by hand, going through each grit. And maybe it did take a little bit longer to get those edges done, but it meant that I didn't burn through the veneer, so it's worth it. You can see a place here on this corner where somebody else had burned through it. There's this, and then another larger spot, which is much more noticeable, but we'll get to that in a minute. After spraying it with water, I noticed that there were still a lot of paint flecks in this top, so I went ahead and added another coat of the stripper. And while that stripper was working its magic, my paint had dried, so I went ahead and sanded it down a little bit with a 220 grit sandpaper. Sanding in between coats is the number one thing that is going to give you a smooth finish in the end. To remove this round of citrus strip, I decided to use the scraper on the 5-in-1 tool. It's a little bit more gentle than the carbide scraper. When it came to removing the leftover residue this time, I used the same method, just spraying it with water, and then I had a scrubby sponge and just used that in place of the steel wool. And finally, this was my third and final coat of paint. Since that top had some red tones in the natural wood, I decided to go ahead and mix up a little bit of a green wash with Fusion Mineral Paint's Conservatory color. And a green wash is exactly how it sounds. It's just green paint with a little bit of water added to it, and the green will just neutralize any of the red in there. And y'all tell me in the comments, are we supposed to spray water on here before doing a green wash? I never can remember, but my thinking is always I'd rather it be a little thin and have to do 2 coats of it than have it be too much and have to somehow take that off. If you've done a green wash before, let me know in the comments what your method is. Do you spray the water on first or not? After brushing that over the entire surface, I wiped it back with a clean rag. With that dry and all of those natural red tones taken care of, it was time to go ahead and start staining the top. Remember when I said that someone else had burned through the veneer on this? That's the spot I was talking about. I thought that I would be able to get some blend all sticks and color it in, but that didn't quite turn out. I kept trying to force those coloring sticks to work behind the scenes, and it was just like no matter how I layered them or what I did, it just did not look right. That being said, staining this was kind of a waste of time. In preparation for replacing the veneer, I went ahead and filled in that spot and leveled it off, sanded it smooth. After that, I placed painter's tape all around the edges. I knew that I was going to be using a spray contact cement, so this would protect the edges from getting that sticky glue all over them. I measured the veneer and left a little bit of an overhang on each side so I would have just a little bit of excess. And I'm cutting this with a razor knife, but I realized after that I could have done it with a really sharp pair of scissors. And I think that would have been easier on the cross grain section. And I'm using a spray contact cement here, and I used 2 coats of this, letting it get tacky in between each coat. And that was 2 coats on the top of the chest and 2 coats on the back of the veneer itself. I laid pieces of scrap wood across and then slowly took them out as I smoothed it with another piece of scrap wood. Made sure to press really firmly the whole way through and try and make sure that there were 0 air bubbles, that everything had adhered perfectly. Once that it had sufficient time to dry and meld together, it was time to go ahead and start cutting off the excess. To cut that off, I just slowly went around each of the edges with that razor knife and slowly cut off little slivers until it was flush with the edge. After trimming it down with the razor knife as much as possible, I went around the edges with a fine grit sandpaper just to make sure that it was flush and straight. Once that was finished, I was ready to stain the new veneer. Once my stain was dry, I sealed everything in Minwax's polyacrylic, and then it was time to reinstall the top. Are any other furniture flippers out there using Walmart bags as plastic to cover things up, or is it just me? Despite the ups and downs with having to replace that veneer, I think this project turned out so cute. I think this will make the perfect coffee table in my client's living room, and she was super happy with it when she picked it up. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for more furniture flipping content, and share this with a friend who also loves before and after transformations. I hope you have a great day.